Thank you, Pastor. I hope everybody enjoyed the pizza. Austin was over here. I pulled him away. He was helping me set up things, and but yeah, maybe next time I'll let him eat something. So, all right. Well, tonight I just kind of want to reintroduce everyone to the format of our Bible study. I try to keep it. I try to stay on point as much as I can, and then try to leave a little bit of time at the end of every Bible study so we can have an open discussion. We also have a private Facebook group for the NHF Bible study. I'm going to walk you guys through that in a minute. The last time we did it, we had some chronological Bibles that people had gotten for me. So if you guys still have those, use them. I've been trying to stock up over the past couple years, but they're hard to find anymore, and unless they're brand new, and who can afford that? So I've been going to like the Bible thrift stores and finding them. We've been using the New Living Translation just because it's a little bit easier to read through, and so if anybody doesn't have one and would like one, I couldn't find any more with the large print, but if you want to go on Amazon or eBay or something, you can probably find some on there. It really is a great study Bible, and this 1 year chronological order is pretty close to the same reading plan that we're going through. So if anybody's interested, just kind of let me know after service. I did bring some with me. The other one, I actually started to look at these for the youth, but I liked it so much. This is the one I've been using. And as my eyes get older, it's kind of sad. It's hard to read. The print just keeps getting smaller. So anyway, Austin, if you would push play. I did a screen recording. Just fair warning, I was on my front porch while I was doing this, and I got attacked by a bee. So it sounds like that on here, I'm pretty sure. Good evening, everyone. This is Brandon. I'm here to show you how to access our Facebook private group app for the NHF Chronological Bible Study, and also to show you which Bible app I prefer to use, but you can use whichever one you want, really. So let's start with the Facebook private group for our Bible study. You just want to go to your Facebook account. If you have Facebook, go to the search, and then you're going to type in NHF Bible Study. Click on that. This is the home page for it. If you're not already a member, you can request to join, or if you'd rather, you can just send me a message and I can send you an invite, whichever's easiest for you. But this is pretty helpful. We post the links to the YouTube channel with the videos. We also will post the reading schedule for the week, and if you have any questions, you can post them on Facebook, or you can open up a discussion with the other members of the group about what we're reading, and put any prayer requests or anything else on there. It's a private group, so it'll just be shared amongst the other members. So that's the Facebook app. If you want to download a Bible app for your phone that has a good reading plan that's pretty similar to ours, go to your app store, and the Bible app I would recommend for this Bible study is the YouVersion app. So you want to go to your search engine on the app store, type in YouVersion, and Bible. Click on that. A couple will come up, but this one right here with the Holy Bible icon, that's one you want. So if you don't have that downloaded already, just go ahead and download it. It's a free app. And then you want to open it. It'll bring it up. This is what the homepage will look like. And then to look for our 1-year chronological Bible study reading plan, you go ahead and type in the search bar 1-year chronological. It should pop up, so you don't have to type out all of chronological, but the 1-year chronological Bible, click on that, and you can hit start plan. It takes you through 365 days, so we're going to go ahead and start this. I'm going to keep it private, but if you want to add friends to it or other members of the group, feel free to do that. It's a good feature. I'm going to go ahead and keep this private because I've already started a bunch doing these videos. So you can see I'm going to click on this top one here, the 1-year chronological reading plan. This is ours. You can see it starts you off on day 1, which they start today. But as you know, we're already about halfway through. So you want to scroll over. The first day of it is actually going to be today, and that's day 169. So you click on that, and you can see it brings up the scriptures we're going to be reading for today, and it gives you a list every day. So go ahead and hit the start reading when you're ready, and you'll see it brings up the scripture verses. If you see up at the top where it says 2 Kings 11, the scripture verse, next to it you see the NLT. That's the version we're using, the New Living Translation. So if you want to change it, you can. You just click on the NLT and it'll bring up this screen. It might already be preset to King James Version or whatever version you've read before if you have it. You can just switch to the New Living Translation. The reason we've chosen this translation is it reads a little easier. So you can see, you can play, and it'll actually
Athaliah,
read
the
it
mother
to
of
you.
King Ahaziah of Judah, learned that her son was dead. She
Which
began
kinda
to
helps
destroy the
sometimes,
rest of the royal
but
family.
if you don't want to, that's fine. You can just arrow over to the right. And as you arrow over, you'll notice the scripture verses change at the top. Again, we're going between 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles because they run congruent to each other. So it's actually in chronological order. We're just switching back between for this reading. So just keep clicking over as you read through each scripture, and then it'll take you through your list. When you're done, it'll show all the checks next to it. And then this page will come up. You can go ahead and click that little check at the top, and you'll see there's a checkbox in the square where it says day 169, and then you can go ahead on with your reading, or you can just wait for it to remind you tomorrow for your reading for the next day. So that is the app. If you guys have any questions about it, I'm available, but hopefully this will be helpful. I want to thank Austin for his technical consult on this. Wouldn't be able to do it without you, Austin. Thank you. Because my dogs kept barking and I kept getting texts, so that was the best one of them, believe it or not. It is really helpful if you guys want to download a Bible app, but I did print off some hard copies of our reading list, and I actually went ahead and printed off the whole year. And again, we're kind of starting halfway through because we've already done that, but I went ahead and just printed off these. We also have a document on our Facebook page that you can access this, so save the rainforest or whatever, but if anybody wants a hard copy, I do have them. So is there any questions so far with the reading plan or the Bible app? Phew. All right. So, and Austin saw how worried I looked. Okay. So today we're going to kind of just review everything that we've gone over, and I kind of want to explain again the format of this. So the chronological Bible study really helps us understand and kind of see the Bible as not just a collection of stories, but of actual historical events. So the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses, and he just put them all in writing. Now, the books of the Bible we kind of do with Moses first, with the exception of Job. We read Genesis, and then this reading plan actually took us to Job right at the end of Genesis, which chronologically that probably makes sense because Job is, they believe, the oldest book in the Bible. So Job was actually a descendant of Abraham. Abraham, we all know Abraham was married to Sarah and he had a concubine, but after Sarah died, Abraham actually took another wife, and Job was one of the descendants of his second wife, not his concubine, but his second wife. So he's actually listed on one of those genealogical pages where it says so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. So that's why Job is where it is. Then as we go through and we read, we're pulling verses from different places. So like 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, 1 King, and 2 Kings all kind of overlap. So we have different verses being pulled in from those places, but they're all, it just kind of helps us put things in perspective on a historical timeline. So that's why we're doing this chronological Bible study, and just putting it in chronological order kind of helps us understand that the Bible is connected. All these verses, a lot of them might sound like it's repeating itself, but it's from a different book written around the same time describing the same events, and that kind of helps. The book of Psalms is kind of mixed throughout all of the first part of the Old Testament, because the book of Psalms is basically a collection of poems written by, like the first psalm we read was at the end of Moses' life, because Psalm 90 was a psalm that Moses wrote towards the end of his life. So we read that psalm right before we saw Moses die. So all of that's why they're kind of mixed in. So David wrote some psalms, and Solomon wrote some, and then, you know, so we just kind of get to see, historically speaking, what David was going through when he wrote the psalm, which just kind of helps put things in order, and really helps us understand the full meaning of those scriptures when you think of it historically speaking and you pair it with others. Just like when we get to the New Testament and we start reading the Gospels, it'll go between all 4 Gospels, because chronologically speaking, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all writing about the same event. So we'll see them all kind of paralleled out as we read them, which I think is amazing, and I think it'll be really helpful for us as far as understanding as a group. Any questions about that? How many of you who've been part of the first part of our Bible study have really enjoyed reading it chronologically? Yeah, I have too. And actually, this is the first time I've read Job in that order, like right at the end of Genesis, and I don't know why I hadn't ever done that before, but check my notes. All right, so I really kind of struggled with condensing this Bible study. I had roughly 30 pages of notes, just kind of reviewing kind of what we've already gone over, and which is too much. So what I did is I just went through and I outlined it. I had a study guide that had a pretty decent outline, and I'm just going to stick to this outline so we can get through it just as a review to bring us to where we're going to start up next week. So first and foremost, I always like thinking about the first verse in the book of John when he says, "In the beginning was the Word The Word was with God, and the Word was God. I think that's important because Jesus was literally the incarnation of the Word, the living Word on earth. So, and everything in this Bible tells us more about him. And that's how we learn him. We learn his character. We learn God's character, and we can feel his heart towards us. So it's important to remember that this whole Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, is all about the Lord. It tells us about him. And if we want to know him, this is how we do it. In Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make man in our image to be like us." So God, right there, when God uses the plural form, when he says, "Let us make man in our image," that's proof of the Godhead. That means Jesus was there in the beginning and the Holy Spirit. We have the Trinity in Genesis. And we'll see we have seen what we've studied, but we have appearances of Jesus in the Old Testament, and we call those Christophanies, but there are different times throughout the Old Testament when Jesus is there. It doesn't say this is Jesus, but it'll say a man who said he's the captain of the host of God's armies is there, or the Prince of Peace, or the high priest of peace, back before there was ever a priest. So we see in Genesis, Jesus was there. And that's important to remember too, because we'll come across that. So, all right, you guys ready? I'm going to start with this outline, and just tell me if I need to slow down at all. So the first part of Genesis, the first 11 chapters, are describing the timeline of man before there were any patriarchs. So from creation to around 2000 BC is what Genesis covers. And we have before the patriarchs, so this is before Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we have an account of the creation of the world, the creation of man and women, or men and women, the fall of man, and original sin. Then we have after the fall, the consequences of that sin. And then we move on to the judgment of God on the time of Noah, what caused the judgment of God, the flood, the results of the flood, and then after the flood. I know this is really simplified. I'm just keeping it that way to kind of help lay a good foundation. So then after the flood, we have the Tower of Babel. You'll remember God's instruction to Adam and Eve was to go forth, be fruitful, and multiply. And so after the flood, people tried gathering together on the plains, and they wanted to build this tower, but they were in direct disobedience with God. They were trying to gather men unto themselves and build something together. They were not spreading across the earth and settling it like God had instructed. So God confused the language, and that's what caused men to kind of scatter. The first time I was teaching it, I was saying, if you don't understand what someone's saying, you're not going to trust them, right? So if I'm talking to somebody, they don't speak my language, but the look on their face is a little unsettling, I'm getting out of there, So that's how God got everybody to go ahead and spread out. And then we see the family lines after the flood and the judgment on all families after the flood. Genesis 12 through 50 covers around 2166 BC to 1650 BC. And this is what covers the patriarchs of Israel. So we get the life of Abraham, the introduction to Abram and Sarah, the covenant God made with Abram. Then we get the life of his son Isaac, Isaac's family. We get the life of Jacob, Abraham's grandson, who's later called Israel. Jacob steals Esau's blessing and runs off, so his brother doesn't kill him. And then we see Jacob's life in Haran, where he had run to, and then his return back to Canaan, the land of his father and grandfather. Then we get the life of Jacob's son Joseph, Joseph's family, Joseph's suffering at the hand of his brothers, being sold into slavery, and then Joseph's exaltation to second in charge of Egypt. And then we get the salvation of Joseph's family. So during the famine, his family came. And then we end out that part on the life of Joseph. And this is when we read the book of Job, right after the life of Joseph, right towards the end of Genesis. And then for Job, we discussed Job's dilemma, all the tragedy that came on Job, the debates of Job and his friends, and then we get the deliverance of Job at the end. Is everybody tracking with me so far? Okay. So next we're going to cover Exodus. Well, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and then Psalm 90. These kind of cover around 1500 BC to 1200 BC, like that 300 or 400 year period. So we see the need in Exodus. We begin by seeing the need of redemption from Egypt. So Israel's population, while in Egypt, their population grew, exploded, but then their affliction also increased over that 400-year period. Then Israel's destruction was planned in Egypt. The Pharaoh was going to kill all the Israelites. They were tired of them, and they probably had done all the work they needed them to do. So then we see during this time the preparation of Israel's leaders. Moses is born. We see Miriam and Aaron in this, and Moses is born. His life is spared. His mom put him in a river, floated him down the river, and then he grew up in Pharaoh's house. So he was actually educated by the leader of the most advanced civilization at the time. So he got the highest education and was taught how to lead people. So we see this development of Israel's leaders. Then Israel calls upon God for deliverance, but God had already been working on it, right? We already had Moses training up. Israel cries out for deliverance, and then God calls Moses, and Moses accepts the call. And then Israel accepts Moses as their leader, as their deliverer. And then we see the redemption of Israel, right? So Moses confronts Pharaoh. First, he confronts Pharaoh with the word, right? Then he confronts Pharaoh with miracles. And when neither one of those worked, he confronts Pharaoh with plagues, right? So we see during the last plague, the children of Israel are redeemed by blood, right? And then they're delivered by the power of God as they leave Egypt. And we see the preservation of Israel. It's a preservation from thirst, from hunger, from defeat, from chaos. God delivers them and carries them through it all. And then we get the revelation of covenant with Israel. So I know we went over this lightly, but we see the 10 Commandments, various laws for the people of Israel, the establishment of a covenant, the design for the tabernacle, where the Ark of the Covenant would be housed and the presence of God would dwell. We see the renewal of this covenant and the construction of the tabernacle. Why is it that Israel had all of these laws and rules that they had to follow? Anybody? Do you remember when we were going over this? So the God of heaven, the Holy One, was going to come and dwell in the midst of this people. His very presence led them by a cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night, and he was going to be in the tabernacle of Moses. So for a holy God to come and dwell amongst sinful men, they had to stay pure, right? And it wasn't because God was just being a diva and, wanted the green M&Ms in his dressing room. It's because he's holy. If people didn't come before him with clean hands and pure hearts, they would drop dead, right? So God was really doing this so that he could stay with his people and lead them. So because of that, we get into Leviticus. Now, we know the Levites were the priestly tribe in Israel. So Leviticus is the book of laws. And we see the laws for approaching God, right? Whether you're a priest or whether you're somebody in the camp of Israel, if you're going to be walking by the presence of God in the tabernacle, you better make sure that you know how to approach him, right? So there's laws for approaching God. There's laws for atonement, right? So that you're pure and cleansed before you go through God or go to meet God. Then we get the laws of sanctification. Again, this is about purity. And there are different laws for the people and the priests, because the priests are actually in close proximity to the Lord, right? That's their job. And so a lot of the scriptures we read when it's talking about men not marrying divorced women and all of that, a lot of those rules are for the priests of Israel, right? The everyday people, they don't apply, and those laws are kind of read out of context. So there are so many people who are under this condemnation because of scriptures that are told to them, and they're out of context, right? So, and I'm not encouraging divorce of any kind or anything, but it's really important when we read the word to read it in context. That's why we're doing this chronological Bible study, because it puts things in context for us, right? And we need to study out the word and know it for ourselves. And so these laws, we want to keep that in mind. These laws, there are different laws for the people and the priests. I'm not saying the people could live all willy-nilly, because they're to be a peculiar people, right? But there were more strict laws for the priests. And again, there were laws for worship, and there were laws for when they inhabited the promised land, the way they were to live after they've walked into God's promises. All right, so Numbers is next. Numbers, another name for the book of Numbers, is the time in the wilderness. And the book of Numbers, literally, the title of it is exactly what it's about. Numbers is a book of counting, of organization, of how they set up the government. That's when we get the first census that Moses did, is in the book of Numbers. So the book of Numbers is in preparation for the people to inherit the promised land, setting up government, systems, organization. And it was also about the sanctification of Israel, right? So we see that. We see the failures of the old generation in the book of Numbers, how they failed and how they would not be entering the promised land because of that. So they failed en route to the promised land, all the murmuring and complaining, and then they failed when they had spies spying out the promised land, and then there were other failures in the wilderness. So through all of these failures and the children of Israel wandering the desert for 40 years, we see a preparation of a new generation. That slave mentality had to die off, right? And there was a new generation that had not known slavery, that didn't remember Egypt. Egypt is a type of the world, right? So they weren't as affected by the world because they didn't know that world, right? They were walking with God. So we see the preparation of the new generation, the reorganization of Israel, because literally there were over 600,000 men of fighting age when they left Egypt, and all of them died off, them, their wives, anybody basically over 20 years of age died off in that 40 years in the wilderness. And when they did the census before they entered the promised land after 40 years, there were 600 new men, right? Young men that had grown up and aged into the fighting age before they went into the promised land. So their numbers were about the same, but these men didn't have that slave mentality. They were gonna fight for what they wanted. They weren't beat down, they didn't have that. So they were like Joshua and Caleb. They felt well able, and they didn't remember a time when God wasn't with them, leading them. So we get the preparation of the new generation, the reorganization of Israel, the regulation of sacrifices and vows, and the conquest and division of Israel. So you remember Moses took the advice of his father-in-law and he delegated, right? So there were 70 men that received the same anointing that was on Moses to help him lead and judge and govern the people. So there's just this reorganization. And then Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, the whole book of Deuteronomy is Moses summarizing everything that had happened, right, since he was called, since right before he was called. So, mind you, Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and in Deuteronomy, it's like a summary of everything that had happened, right? And he does this in preparation to get these people ready to possess the land because he knew he wasn't going with them, right? He was going to put Joshua in charge, and he wasn't going to cross into the promised land. So he wanted to remind them, some of these people, these young people, don't remember Egypt. They don't remember crossing the Red Sea. They were too young, or they were born afterwards. So Moses is telling them everything, and he summarizes it in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy comes from the Greek word meaning second law. So Moses' first speech in Deuteronomy is a preamble of the covenant. He just reviews the covenant. And then he reviews the acts of God, all that God had done. His second speech in the book of Deuteronomy is an introduction to the law of God. So he's reminding them of God's law, and he keeps telling them. So then he explains the stipulations of the covenant, and then he explains some of the additional laws, like not eating shellfish and all of that. Then his third speech, Moses confirms the covenant. Like he goes over it again. Like he's just repetitive with it and keeps reminding them the covenant is established before they go into the promised land. And then there's a changing of the covenant mediator. So Moses hands off this responsibility to Joshua and says, here you go, it's yours. And then we get where we read Psalm 90, which is the song of Moses, or the Psalm of Moses. And it's beautiful if you get a chance to read it and you think of it as Moses saying all this at the end of his life before they left to go on into the promised land without him. It's beautiful to see it in that context. So then Joshua takes over, and we're at right around 1400 BC to about 1200 BC. And we see the conquest of Canaan, or the promised land that God had promised Abraham. We see there's a preparation for the conquest itself, and then we start to see there are unconquered parts of the promised land. So, and by that, God told the children of Israel, when you go into the promised land, drive all of the inhabitants out. Don't leave anybody there, right? And the children of Israel didn't do that. They made compromises when they went in. And because of that, they get into trouble, right? So We see the second part of Joshua, we see the settlement of Canaan. They settle parts east of the Jordan River and parts west of the Jordan River, and then they kind of reiterate the covenant for their settlement of Canaan, or the promised land. Excuse me. So, because the children of Israel did not drive out all of the inhabitants, these inhabitants would pain them for the rest of their time. Even today, Philistines, referred to Philistines as the Bible, is current day Palestine. Philistine has just become the word Palestine. So we still see that struggle today. It's still going on. And because the children of Israel didn't drive out all of the inhabitants of the promised land like God instructed, the inhabitants then rose up against the children of Israel and warred against them and would oppress them. And then the children of Israel would cry out because they were being oppressed, and God would send a judge to deliver them, right? And then they would turn back to the Lord. They would have peace for a time, and then they would start turning and worshiping other gods, turn away from the Lord. And one of the inhabitants they didn't drive out would rise up and oppress them again, and God would send another judge. So we are in the book of Judges now. And in the book of Judges, we see the deterioration of Israel, the corruption, the failure to complete to complete driving out all of the inhabitants. We see God's judgment for this failure. And really, it's not so much God's judgment. God told them what to do, and they didn't follow through. So it's the consequences of them not being obedient to God. And then we see the deliverance of Israel. We see these different campaigns from the north to the south to central Israel, all of it during the time of the Judges. We see the depravity of Israel, the idolatry, the immorality, and then we start to see division and civil war within Israel. And this is right around the time that the book of Ruth occurs, during all of this chaos and turbulence and division. And we see that Ruth is the grandmother of King David. So God is already starting to answer prayers that haven't even been said yet, right? So it was a perfect time for us to read the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth is basically about two things. We see Ruth's love and devotion is demonstrated. She loves Naomi. She commits to stay with Naomi, and she follows Naomi back to Bethlehem. Ruth was a Moabite. She was one of the inhabitants of the land that was not driven out by the children of Israel. So we see God use it, and he brought Ruth to take care of Naomi, and then she remains with Naomi and cares for her. They return to Bethlehem, and then we see that Ruth's devotion and love is rewarded, right? She asks Boaz, her kinsman redeemer, for redemption, right? She asked him, you remember we were reading it, and she came in and she sat at his feet, and she asked him to cover her with the hem of his robe. In those days, the hem of the robe symbolized rank or authority. Like now we have the guys in the military or police officers, they have the stripes on their arms, and it shows whether they're a sergeant or whatever. In those days, that was displayed on the hem of a garment. So when Boaz asks Ruth to cover her, he's asking her to cover her with his authority. When the woman with the issue of blood goes after Jesus and she just wants to grab the hem of his garment, she wanted to grab his authority, right? The symbol of his authority. So that's very significant. We're going to see that a lot. So Ruth is rewarded by redemption, right? Boaz redeems her. And once she asked for his help, Boaz went to work on her behalf to redeem her, to save Naomi, to get back that land. So we go from Ruth to 1 Samuel. And, well, I'm going to just go ahead and outline 1st and 2nd Samuel, but just keep in mind 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles all kind of overlap here. So Samuel is the last judge of Israel and the first prophet. He starts the school of the prophets. So Samuel's that transition. Eli was the second to the last judge. He was also the high priest in Israel. And we all know the story of Samuel. Then Samuel appoints Saul as the first king of Israel. The people of Israel reject God because God had been their king up to that point. And so Saul is appointed as king. But Saul didn't have a king's heart, and God had already set in motion for David to be king, a man after his own heart. So we see after Paul is appointed king, the first human king of Israel, the people reject God as their king. But then after Saul is king, he disobeys God, and then God rejects him as king. We see David becomes king. We see David's triumphs, political, spiritual, and tactically with the military. And then we see the transgressions of King David, adultery, murder, just to name a few. And I said this the other day, but like David messed up probably way more than Saul did, right? And what he did was actually worse than what Saul did. But what made David a great king is his humility and his humbling himself, right? He wasn't prideful when he was confronted with sin. He just repented. He knew he was wrong, and he didn't want there to be anything between him and God. So, but because of his sin, we see the troubles David faced in his home and in his kingdom. And then we get into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It covers the lineage of from Adam to Saul. We see the family of Adam, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and also David and Saul. It goes over the reign of King David from the time he becomes king to him moving the Ark of the Covenant, his military victories, his preparation to build the temple in Jerusalem, and the last days of David. Then we get into in 2nd Chronicles, it starts to talk about the reign of Solomon, how Solomon succeeds David as king. There's a completion of the temple in Jerusalem, and then we see the glory of Solomon's reign, and then the death of Solomon. And then the last part of it chronicles the reigns of selected kings of Israel, of Judah, rather. At this time, we read the book of Psalms, and again, we have Psalms from David. Overlap here. So Samuel is the last judge of Israel and the first prophet. He starts the school of the prophets. So Samuel's that transition. Eli was the second to the last judge. He was also the high priest in Israel. And we all know the story of Samuel. Then Samuel appoints Saul as the first king of Israel. The people of Israel reject God because God had been their king up to that point. And so Saul is appointed as king. But Saul didn't have a king's heart, and God had already set in motion for David to be king, a man after his own heart. So we see after Paul is appointed king, the first human king of Israel, the people reject God as their king. But then after Saul is king, he disobeys God, and then God rejects him as king. We see David becomes king. We see David's triumphs, political, spiritual, and tactically with the military. And then we see the transgressions of King David, adultery, murder, just to name a few. And I said this the other day, but like David messed up probably way more than Saul did, right? And what he did was actually worse than what Saul did. what made David a great king is his humility and his humbling himself, right? He wasn't prideful when he was confronted with sin. He just repented. He knew he was wrong, and he didn't want there to be anything between him and God. So, but because of his sin, we see the troubles David faced in his home and in his kingdom. And then we get into First and Second Chronicles. It covers the lineage of from Adam to Saul. We see the family of Adam, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and also David and Saul. It goes over the reign of King David from the time he becomes king to him moving the Ark of the Covenant, his military victories, his preparation to build the temple in Jerusalem, and the last days of David. Then we get into in Second Chronicles, it starts to talk about the reign of Solomon, how Solomon succeeds David as king. There's a completion of the temple in Jerusalem, and then we see the glory of Solomon's reign, and then the death of Solomon. And then the last part of it chronicles the reigns of selected kings of